It's May 2020. It's not really. I'm using it as like a narrative storytelling device, but just kind of go with me, and I think you'll get it. It's May 2020. A devastating virus named COVID-19 has begun to spread across the globe. Yet among all of these differing opinions within the medical community, as it were, there is a consensus that none of them deny.
Keeping hands clean is one of the most effective ways to prevent the spread of many contagious illnesses.
Judy, I wash my hands 50 times a day.
It's definitely more important than ever with the pandemic of coronavirus.
Rewind almost 200 years, it's 1840. A devastating fever is killing 1 in 7 patients during childbirth. Strikingly, most doctors are doing little to address it. There is no consensus on how it could be stopped. It's assumed it's nature taking its course, and it's best to avoid a hospital setting where the fever seems to be concentrating during childbirth. There is seemingly only one man refusing to let these deaths transpire. What's his name? It's Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. Now today, we recognize Dr. Semmelweis as the first doctor who washed their hands before surgery. And he proved that hand washing saves lives. But in so doing, he revealed the deeply rooted human resistance to challenging established norms. Yes, the Jewish obstetrician changed medicine forever, and all it ever cost him was his life. There's a first of everything, and this is the story of the first doctor to wash their hands before surgery. I'm Paul Neihart, I'm your host, and we're gonna get through this one together. Now, Semmelweis' story has resonated far beyond its time. It is as impactful for medical professionals as it is for storytellers. It is stamped in medical journals and has gained the attention of some of America's greatest storytellers, particularly the American author, Kurt Vonnegut. Now, Vonnegut, probably one of the 50 greatest American authors of all time, had an opportunity during a graduation speech. In 1981, he gave a speech to graduates at Southampton College. Now, he had 20 minutes to tell this group of impressionable young adults anything that he wanted. And he proceeded to tell them this, I quote, "I will go on to recommend to all young people everywhere that their hero be Ignaz Semmelweis." Now this is the first podcast. How are you? Yeah. This is where we celebrate and reflect on everything that came first, deciding right from wrong, or exploring some alternate version of the truth. It's not really the bag here, and it's not always the most righteous objective. Kurt Vonnegut cited Semmelweis as a hero not because the doctor was so obviously right, but chiefly because the doctor refused to participate in the wrong. Anyone with a thought before bed can at one time be right, but refusing to participate in the wrong, it's what can ensure a lasting legacy. So who is Ignaz Semmelweis? He was born in Budapest, Hungary in the early 1800s, and he was one of 10 children in a Hungarian Jewish family. He began practicing medicine in his neighboring country of Austria and Vienna. Now, from the outset, Semmelweis faced prejudice. He was a Jewish man born in a predominantly non-Jewish society. That was one challenge. He was an awkward communicator, had little to no people skills. That was another. Consequently, he was relegated to midwifery. This was considered an inferior medical field during his time. As one esteemed medical school noted, said that obstetrics was foreign to the habits of a gentleman of enlarged academical education. Basically, if you're practicing this, you must not be a very refined doctor. So, to understand what Semmelweis faced, there's that. But we also need to understand the world that he lived in. In the mid-1800s, hospital deliveries had a far higher fatality rate than at-home births. Hospitals is where the poor went. Home is where the rich had their births. As evidence of this, the first 38 presidents, where were they born? They were born at home. And most of them were well off. Ironically, primarily one of the first ones that wasn't was Jimmy Carter. And he was the first president that was born in a hospital. Now, Dr. Semmelweis focused his life working almost solely on the poor, so he operated almost exclusively out of hospitals. Now, it was there where he made his discovery. He discovered that it was dirty hands. Dirty hands were causing more deaths at the hospital, but doctors there didn't want to hear anything about it. In Vienna, the medical community told him to take a hike. They wouldn't tolerate his theory, even though Dr. Semmelweis had a great deal of data to support it, namely less people dying. He was forced to return to his homeland, where even then, his fortunes didn't change. They got rid of him too. They didn't want to hear anything to do with this story, and tragically, Dr. Semmelweis was committed, eventually, to what you can call an insane asylum. And that's where he would die at the age of 47. It's an appalling story, really. A man who saved so many lives had his own life cut so brutally short. His only offense was challenging the established status quo. His greatest crime was having the courage to prove his point and to point the finger at his fellow doctors. Oops. The mere assumption that doctors could be complicit in the death of a patient, let alone be directly causing it, was not well received in the mid-19th century, but Semmelweis didn't presume. He didn't assume. He directly stated he was a man that proved that to be honorable in what you could probably call a dishonorable world, it wasn't enough to be right. One must have the courage and conviction to prove others wrong. Now, to understand the urgency of the fight Semmelweis found himself in, why he felt so compelled to convince doctors that they could be saving lives, let's look at the stark reality of the time. By most accounts, yes, Semmelweis was likely as awkward as he was audacious, but he was still utterly convinced that too many people were dying unnecessarily. In 1846, 14 out of every 100 women were dying from childbearing fever. To put this in perspective, today in the modern US, roughly 18 out of every 100,000 women die during childbirth. The very notion that decaying matter, germs, could be spread and were harmful did not formally exist in the mid-1800s. Germ theory didn't exist for another 15 years after his death. So the idea that a doctor should wash their hands prior to surgery was not just an afterthought, it was frowned upon. It was not unsanitary, it was simply unnecessary. Now, if you're looking for leading voices at the time to support this notion, there's a gentleman named Charles Meigs. He was the leading voice in obstetrics. And naturally, of course, he was a prominent critic of hand washing as well. While he never went after Semmelweis' his discovery directly, he shared the prominent sentiment that doctors, quote, were gentlemen and a gentleman's hands are always clean, unquote. Dr. Semmelweis was the first doctor to wash his hands prior to surgery. But he wasn't the first to make a connection between the women dying of childbirth in the hospital and those surviving at their homes. There's a gentleman named Alexander Gordon of Aberdeen who wrote the treatise on the epidemic of puerperal fever in 1795. He made connections between sanitation and this childbearing fever, but not explicitly to hand washing. He does recommend that the patient should be, let's say, shielded from mental agitation. That's good. He does recommend 6 leeches to the groin. He does recommend the subtraction of 6 or 8 ounces of blood monthly. He does recommend that 12 hours after the delivery to have the intestines cleared out with 2 to 3 cathartic enemata. Okay. Nowhere in his book does he publicly, explicitly recommend that doctors wash their hands before surgery. Yeah, in his book, it's over 300 pages long. Now, another man came much closer. This was during Semmelweis' time. A gentleman named Oliver Wendell Holmes practiced medicine in the same decade as him. Now, in 1843, he made a connection between doctors and this childbearing fever that was killing so many women. He found that the condition was contagious and that doctors were the carriers. Whoa. Now, Holmes, like Semmelweis, felt it was essential for doctors to clean themselves, a practice, as mentioned, that many doctors took umbrage to. They didn't want to hear about it. But despite this criticism, his findings, his statements, they didn't cost him a career. Holmes, he was not a Hungarian Jew. He was from the US. He was a Harvard man. He was a scholar. a poet, an inventor. He was much more than a doctor. He had an illustrious circle. He was friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson and the like. His beliefs, while they were offensive to the medical community, they caused more controversy than condemnation. His words did not cost him a career or a life. He actually died a tenured professor at Harvard University in 1883. He was 85 years old. Now, Holmes acknowledged that doctors were a source of the disease, but he didn't identify how they carried it. And this is the most important part. It was Dr. Semmelweis who made this specific link between the hands and patient health. Semmelweis was adamant, brutally so at that, about hand washing. And he is the reason that doctors wash their hands today as opposed to taking full showers or days off between a child delivery. Consider that Dr. Semmelweis didn't study at more prestigious academic institutions than other doctors. He didn't have exclusive access not offered to other doctors. He didn't possess exquisite eyesight or intuitive insight that gave him the ability to recognize microscopic germs. There was just one thing that separated him from other doctors. He was suspicious. Okay, two things. He also cared. Losing one patient, let alone 14 out of 100, was too many for him. Chokes me up. He actually lost one of his close friends, what was said to be one of his close friends, to the childbearing fever. A man, who obviously wasn't in childbirth, but was performing an autopsy. Yeah. It was the post-mortem of a woman that cost this man his life. Now, to understand how childbearing fever was spreading, consider an analogy. The major motion picture, Chain Reaction, features a young Keanu Reeves. His character discovers that a technology provides a constant source of energy, which Morgan Freeman, his whole role is trying to steal it from him. But anyway, this source of energy is fueled by a self-sustaining sequence that keeps going on and going on. It goes on forever. Why it's called chain reaction. Now, Dr. Semmelweis never saw a chain reaction, but he knew a deadly sequence when he saw one. But it was the death of Semmelweis' associate, Dr. Kolechka, that helped him discover where this chain began. Dr. Kolechka was a professor at the Vienna General Hospital, and he was a man that Semmelweis was said to greatly admire, could have been his friend. Either way, it was during an autopsy in the presence of students where Dr. Kolechka had his finger accidentally poked by a scalpel. For those scoring at home, that's something that's definitely not meant to happen during an autopsy. Kolechka quickly fell ill and suffered a devastating death, killing him in short order. The point is, Kolechka's symptoms of how he died were almost exactly the same as the patients that were dying from childbearing fever, if not exactly the same. Semmelweis was convinced that this was obviously no coincidence. And as it turned out, Dr. Kolechka wasn't just performing an autopsy on just any patient at the time of his poking. The deceased was a pregnant woman who had died of childbearing fever. In fact, many of the doctors performed autopsies on these women, then went on to deliver a baby. Did they wash their hands? Of course not. Semmelweis now knew the hands were the cause of the disease. A chlorine solution applied to kill the germs after the autopsy would cut off the cycle. There would be no more germs to carry from the dead to the living. The chain reaction would be no more. Of course, for us in the modern day, the oversight that dirty hands transmit diseases is at best laughable, and at worst implausible. But doctors never saw themselves as a potential problem. They were always the solution. And many of them had to have thought that death was a natural part of their trade. Dr. Semmelweis did not. He paid attention to how we lost people, particularly Dr. Kolechka, a man he admired. And because of this, he became the first person to recognize the transfer of disease from hand to man, and most significantly, to tell the world to do something about it. Now, the effectiveness of Dr. Semmelweis' methods was evident. While other hospitals had 20% of their patients die from childbirth fever, his hospitals had a mortality rate of 2%. Conventional wisdom would hold that empirical evidence alone would win out. No argument needed. Who cares if Semmelweis didn't have any charm? He called some of those, though, objecting to his theory, his data, he called them ignoramuses, which was kind, compared to those he called murderers. Semmelweis' behavior led to his removal from the Austrian community and then the Hungarian medical community. And then eventually, in short order, he suffered from mental illness. Some say Alzheimer's, some say it could have just been exhaustion. No one really knows. But it could be assumed that maybe he was just couldn't tolerate living in a world that had so much unnecessary death, and quote-unquote lost his mind. His wife lured him to a mental institution. He was committed, and he died before his treatment made it to 2 weeks. And his wife thought enough to put him into this facility, but not to attend his funeral. She said she was too sick too. No one really attended his funeral. None of his friends, assuming he still had any. His family, they never made it. There were 2 men, Karl and Gustav Braun, who attended the service. Now, during his life, somewhat ironically, they could best be described as Semmelweis' rivals, maybe even enemies even. Despite their scholarly open opposition to Semmelweis' finding, the hospital where they practiced medicine had a mortality rate on par with Semmelweis. And it's largely presumed now that despite not saying so in public, actually to the contrary, they sanitized their hands in private. Upon Semmelweis' death, the death rate amongst childbearing women at this former hospital where he used to work skyrocketed. They saw an almost 600% increase in fatalities. None of the doctors adopted Semmelweis' hand-washing technique. They would rather succumb to seeing their patients die than prescribe to a new idea. And perhaps most fittingly, his impact is not only felt with doctors who now religiously wash their hands prior to surgery, but also with psychologists who are studying human behavior. Yes, today, psychologists have coined a phrase for the instinctive and immediate rejection of ideas that counter established norms. What do they refer to this? They refer to this rejection as the Semmelweis reflex. So now you know the story of the first doctor who washed their hands before surgery. I'm Paul Neihart, reminding you to be first when you should, last when you shouldn't. And I'll see you next time.